They laughed before he played a single note. Not just the boy who sat next to him in chemistry. Not just the girl who had borrowed his pencil twice that semester and never returned it. Not even the teacher in the third row whose mouth moved into something that was not quite a smile and not quite nothing. 400 people in the most expensive auditorium in Philadelphia. Steinway grand piano worth more than the apartment Isaiah James Calloway shared with his father. Stage lights, cameras, and a 16-year-old boy standing beside an instrument his father had been wiping clean every Friday for 14 years. His right hand moved to his jacket pocket. Inside it, an old ivory piano key he had been carrying since he was 7. Nobody knew about the key. Nobody knew about the woman upstairs, who had heard him through a thin wall 3 years ago and decided he was worth teaching. And nobody in that auditorium knew what was about to happen when the janitor's son sat down at a piano his father had been cleaning since before the boy could reach the pedals. Isaiah woke at 6:14 in the morning to the smell of eggs that had already gone cold. The plate was on the counter beside the stove, covered with a second plate turned upside down the way his father always did it. 2 eggs, 2 slices of toast. A glass of orange juice with the condensation already running down the sides. Curtis had made breakfast before leaving for work. He always made breakfast before leaving for work. He had been making breakfast before leaving for work since Isaiah was 7 years old, and there was no longer anyone else in the apartment to do it. The kitchen was quiet. The apartment was quiet. The particular quiet of a place where one person has already been awake for hours and left, and another person is just arriving into the space that was made ready for them. Isaiah sat down and ate the eggs cold. He did not heat them up. He never heated them up. Something about eating them the way his father had left them felt like a small act of receiving, like saying thank you without saying anything. On the counter beside the plate was a note. A small square of paper torn from the pad Curtis kept beside the phone. 4 words in his father's handwriting. The same 4 words that had been on that counter every school morning for as long as Isaiah could remember. Do good work today. Not good luck. Not, I believe in you. Not, make me proud. Just, do good work today. The kind of instruction that asks nothing of the world and everything of the person reading it. Isaiah folded the note and put it in his back pocket the way he always did. He had a drawer in his bedroom with hundreds of these notes. He had never thrown one away. He got dressed. Clean pants. A dark shirt without any logos. Shoes his father had found at a clearance sale 2 months ago. Still in decent shape. His backpack was 3 years old. The zipper on the front pocket had stopped working last semester. He used the main compartment for everything now. He brushed his teeth. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. The face that looked back was his mother's face. Everyone said so. The eyes, the jaw, the specific way his mouth sat when he was not smiling and not frowning, just present. His right hand found the jacket pocket. His fingers closed around the piano key without thinking about it. The way you touch a door handle before leaving, the way you check for your wallet. Automatic. Something his body did before his mind registered the instruction. He did not take it out. He just held it for a second, then let go. He picked up his backpack. He looked at the kitchen one more time. The plate, the glass, the note that was no longer on the counter because it was in his pocket now. The empty chair across from where he had been sitting. The chair where his mother used to sit. The chair that Curtis had never moved, not once in 9 years. It was still there. It would always be there. Isaiah locked the door behind him. He was not afraid of the talent show. Not exactly. He was afraid of what came after it. After tonight, one way or another, people at Whitmore would know his name. Not as Calloway from the custodial staff directory, as something else. And at a place like Whitmore, being seen when you are the janitor's son could cost more than staying invisible ever had. He had been invisible at Whitmore for 3 years. Tonight, he was going to make himself visible in a room that had never once made space for him. He understood what that might cost. Whitmore Preparatory Academy sat on 11 acres in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood of Philadelphia. Not the Philadelphia that Isaiah came from. A different version of it. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns were maintained by companies and the driveways were long enough that the houses needed to be seen from a distance to be understood. The school had been founded in 1892 by a textile manufacturer who believed that children of a certain background deserved a certain kind of education. That belief had held for over 100 years. The tuition was $45,000 a year. The hallways had the names of donors engraved into marble panels above the doorways. The science labs had equipment newer than the equipment in the hospital closest to Isaiah's apartment. The parking lot where parents dropped off their children had BMWs and Teslas and SUVs that cost more than the apartment Isaiah shared with his father. The parking lot where staff parked was behind the building, 200 meters from the main entrance, out of sight. Isaiah attended Whitmore because of a policy called the Staff Dependent Tuition Waiver. A number of private schools in the United States offer this. If you work full-time on the custodial or administrative staff, your child attends free. It is a real policy. It exists on paper and in practice. What it does not cover is the distance between attending a place and belonging in it. Isaiah had a seat. He had a student ID. He had a locker in the same hallway as everyone else. He had access to the same classrooms, the same textbooks, the same cafeteria serving the same food. What he did not have was a single person at Whitmore who had ever looked at him and seen someone who was supposed to be there. Nobody bullied him. That would have required noticing him first. What happened instead was subtler and in some ways worse. He was simply not present in the social architecture of the school. When students formed groups for projects, his name was skipped, not maliciously. The way you skip a line in a list, you are reading too fast to read carefully. When conversations happened in hallways between classes, they happened around him, not excluding him, just not including him. The way conversations happen around a piece of furniture that has always been in a room. He was the janitor's son. In the unspoken hierarchy of Whitmore, he was an extension of the supply closet his father maintained. Part of the building's infrastructure. Present, functional, not meant to be looked at directly. He noticed. He had been noticing for 3 years. He noticed the way you notice weather after enough seasons. Not with anger, not with sadness. Just with the flat accuracy of someone who has learned to read a room and accept what the room is telling him. The auditorium was the largest room on campus. Oak floors, professional lighting rig, seating for 400, and at the center of the stage, a Steinway Model D concert grand piano, black lacquer, lid propped half open. Worth more than most of the houses in the neighborhood Isaiah went home to every evening. It sat on that stage like something waiting, like something that had been waiting for a long time and had learned patience from the waiting. Isaiah passed the auditorium every day on his way to third period. Every day he looked through the open doors at the Steinway. Every day he kept walking. He had never touched it. The piano belonged to the auditorium. The auditorium belonged to Whitmore, and Whitmore did not belong to him, not on any level that mattered. Not in any way he could feel in his body when he walked through its doors each morning and walked out of them each afternoon and understood that the space between those two walks was borrowed time in someone else's building. Except for one thing. His father cleaned that piano every Friday afternoon with a soft flannel cloth and a small bottle of instrument-grade polish that Curtis kept in a specific compartment of his supply cart. Curtis Calloway wiped down the most expensive instrument in the school with the same hands that mopped the bathrooms and emptied the trash cans and replaced the paper towels in the dispensers by the gymnasium. Nobody at Whitmore had ever watched him do it. Nobody had ever thought about what it meant for a man to spend 14 years maintaining something beautiful that his own son was not expected to play. Isaiah thought about it. Every time he looked at the Steinway through those auditorium doors, he did not see a piano. He saw every Friday afternoon his father had spent running a cloth along its surface with a care that most people reserved for things they owned. Isaiah had never played the Steinway, but his father's hands had touched it 1,000 times. That was close enough. For now. Curtis James Calloway had not planned to be a janitor. He had an associate degree in electrical technology from the Community College of Philadelphia. He had been good at the work. Reliable. The kind of technician who showed up on time and solved the problem and did not need to be asked twice. He had been 29 years old and working steady when Denise got the diagnosis. Lung cancer, stage 3. The kind of number that changes every number after it. He needed a job with health insurance. Not the basic kind. The kind that covered oncology and hospital stays and the specific medications that kept a person alive long enough to see their son turn 7. Whitmore Preparatory Academy offered full medical coverage to its custodial staff. It also offered free tuition for their children. Curtis did the math the way a man does math when the variables are his wife's life and his son's future. Health insurance plus tuition waiver equaled mopping floors. He made the trade. He never once called it a sacrifice. He called it the job. That had been 14 years ago. Denise died when Isaiah was 7. Not suddenly, slowly, the way a light dims when the power is going but has not gone yet. One morning she was at the kitchen table drinking coffee and talking about a show she had seen on television the night before. 2 weeks later she was in the hospital. 3 weeks after that she was not anywhere anymore. Curtis did not describe the loss. He did not talk about it. What he did was continue. He got up at 4:30. He made breakfast. He went to work. He came home. He made dinner. He helped Isaiah with homework until Isaiah stopped needing help, and then he sat at the kitchen table anyway while Isaiah worked. Not because he was needed, but because the table was where they were together, and being together was the thing that kept the apartment from becoming what it would have become if either of them had started eating alone. The chair where Denise used to sit remained at the table. Curtis never moved it. He never put anything on it. It sat empty at every meal for 9 years, not as a memorial, not as a shrine, just as a fact. She had sat there. The chair was hers. Moving it would have meant deciding she was finished being part of the household, and Curtis had not made that decision and was not going to. His hands told the story his mouth never did, rough, calloused across the palms. The knuckles slightly thickened the way hands get after years of chemical cleaners and cold water and gripping mop handles for 8-hour shifts, but the fingernails were always clean, always trimmed. That detail mattered to Curtis in a way he could not have explained if someone had asked. It was the difference between a man who cleaned things and a man who had stopped caring for himself in the process of caring for everything else. He would not be the second kind of man. He mopped floors the way some people write letters, with attention, with intention, with the specific focus of someone who believed that the quality of the work was the message, not the status of the work. He knew every crack in the wall of hallway B. He knew which bathroom faucet in the West Wing ran 2 degrees warmer than the others. He fixed the hinge on the chemistry lab door before the teacher noticed it was loose. The kind of man who solved problems before they became problems, because solving them afterward meant someone had already been inconvenienced, and Curtis could not tolerate being the reason for that. Do good work. That was the whole philosophy. 4 words. He wrote them on a piece of paper every morning and left them on the kitchen counter beside his son's breakfast. Not because the words were complicated, because they were true, and because true things need to be repeated. Not once. Every day, until the person hearing them stops hearing them as words and starts hearing them as the sound of someone who has not given up on the ordinary act of showing up and doing the thing in front of them well. He knew Isaiah liked music. The boy wore earbuds on the bus. He hummed sometimes while doing homework, a habit he seemed unaware of. Curtis noticed the way you notice things about a person you have studied for 16 years without them knowing they were being studied. But he did not know his son played piano. He did not know about the lessons. He did not know about the woman who lived upstairs. And he did not know that tonight his son had signed up to sit down at the instrument Curtis had been polishing every Friday for 14 years and play it in front of 400 people who had never once thought to wonder whether the Curtis, janitor's son, had anything worth hearing. Isaiah had not told him. That fact would matter later. It would matter more than almost anything else in this story. But for now, it was just a gap, a small silence between a father and a son. The kind of silence that looks like nothing until the moment it breaks open, and you realize it had been holding everything. The piano key had been in Isaiah's pocket for 9 years. It was ivory, slightly yellowed, the kind of yellow that happens to things that were once white and have been held too many times by hands that were warm. It was a G4, the G above middle C. It had come from a piano that no longer existed in a hallway that had been repainted twice since. 9 years earlier. Isaiah was 7. Denise had been gone for 3 weeks. Curtis brought his son to the school on a Sunday afternoon because there was no one else to watch him. Isaiah's aunt worked the afternoon shift at the hospital. The apartment was not a place Curtis wanted to leave a 7-year-old alone in. Not yet, not 3 weeks after. So Isaiah sat on the hallway floor outside the auditorium with a coloring book and a sandwich in a plastic bag while Curtis buffed the floor 20 meters away. The school was replacing the old upright piano in the music room. The new one had arrived the previous week. The old one sat in the hallway near the loading dock, scratched, out of tune, waiting to be hauled away by whoever hauled away things that institutions no longer wanted. One of its keys had come loose. G4. It had fallen onto the floor. A small piece of aged ivory lying on linoleum. Curtis walked past it on his way to refill the buffer solution. He stopped. He picked it up. Not because he knew what it was, because it was on the floor, and he was the man who picked things up off floors. That was what he did. He looked at it for a moment, turned it over in his hand. Then he walked to where Isaiah was sitting and held it out. Here. I do not know what it is exactly, but it came from something that makes music. Isaiah took it. He held it in his palm, small enough to close his fingers around. He did not say anything. He was 7 and 3 weeks past the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and he was sitting on a hallway floor in a school that was not his, while his father worked 20 meters away. He pressed the key into his palm and closed his hand around it and did not let go for the rest of the afternoon. He did not let go for the next 9 years. Curtis did not know he had given his son anything important. He had picked something up off the floor and handed it to a child who needed something to hold. That was all. He turned back to the buffer and finished the floor and drove Isaiah home and made dinner and put him to bed and did not think about the piano key again. He was a man who picked things up. That was simply what he did. The weight of the gesture lived entirely in the receiver. The giver had already moved on to the next task, the next floor, the next thing that needed to be done. That was the thing about Curtis Calloway. His kindness was so ordinary to him that he could not see it. It had no performance in it, no audience requirement, no awareness of its own significance. It was just a man picking something up off the floor and handing it to his son, the way you hand someone a glass of water, the way you hold a door without thinking about it, without knowing you were doing something that would be carried in a jacket pocket for 9 years and touched 10,000 times and never once explained to the man who gave it. Monique Delphine Watts lived on the 3rd floor of the same building where Curtis and Isaiah lived on the 2nd. A brick building in West Philadelphia, built in the 1960s, with walls thin enough to hear a neighbor's television if they kept it above a certain volume. Thin enough to hear a phone ring 2 floors up. Thin enough, as it turned out, to hear a 13-year-old boy tapping his fingers on a kitchen table in a pattern that was not random. But that came later. Monique had performed at Carnegie Hall in 1988. She had been 32 years old. She had recorded 3 albums of Chopin and Debussy for a label that no longer existed. She had toured Europe twice, played in concert halls in Vienna and Prague, and a small theater in Lyon where the acoustics were so precise that she said later it was the only room she had ever played in where the piano talked back. A critic for a classical music journal once described her hands as being able to hold a conversation with the keys. She kept that review in a drawer. She did not frame it. She did not need to. She knew what her hands could do. Then rheumatoid arthritis arrived when she was 41. Not suddenly, not a cliff, a slope, the kind you do not notice until you look down and realize the ground is much further away than it used to be. The joints in her fingers stiffened first. Then the knuckles swelled. Then the speed went. Then the control. Not all at once. Over months. Over a year. Over the particular kind of time that passes when the thing you have built your life around is leaving your body at a pace just slow enough that you can watch it go. She did not lose the ability to play entirely. She lost the ability to play at the level she considered worth playing at. That was the difference. She could sit at a piano and produce sound. But the distance between what she heard in her mind and what her hands could deliver had become a gap she could not close. And for Monique Delphine Watts, playing below the standard she had set for herself was worse than silence. So she chose silence. She lived alone now. A 2-bedroom apartment. The second bedroom had been a studio once. Now it held boxes and a shelf of records she rarely played. She taught piano to a few children in the neighborhood. $20 an hour, cash. The parents did not know she had played Carnegie Hall. The children did not know what Carnegie Hall was. She did not tell them. The old upright Yamaha in her living room was the most expensive thing she owned. Its keys had yellowed slightly. The sustain pedal responded half a beat slow. It was not a great instrument, but it was honest. It said what it said without pretending to be something it was not. 3 years before the talent show, a Tuesday night, Monique was sitting in her living room, reading when she heard it. Not music, not exactly. A tapping, fingers on wood, coming through the floor, from the apartment below. She almost ignored it. Almost. But something in the rhythm stopped her. It had structure. It had a repeating pattern with a variation in the fourth measure that was not accidental. It was the sound of someone trying to reproduce a melody they had heard, working it out by feel, on a surface that could not make the sounds they were hearing in their head. She listened closer. Underneath the tapping faintly the tinny sound of a keyboard, a cheap one, half the keys producing no sound at all. She heard what was missing, and she recognized in the spaces between the broken keys the shape of someone who could hear what the instrument was supposed to sound like, even when the instrument could no longer produce it. Musicians have a word for this. They call it ear. The ability to hear music, not as a sequence of sounds, but as a structure, a language, something with grammar and syntax and meaning that exists before any instrument touches it. Most people are not born with it. It cannot be taught. It can only be developed in someone who already has it, and the boy downstairs had it. She knocked on the Callaway door the next afternoon. Curtis opened it, still in his work clothes, the faint smell of floor cleaner on his hands. "I live upstairs. I heard your son playing last night. I used to teach piano. I would like to offer him lessons. Free." Curtis looked at her. He did not ask why. He did not ask for credentials. He did not ask what the catch was. He asked one question. "When do we start?" That was Curtis. The kind of man who, when someone offered his son something good, said thank you and asked when it began. Not because he was naive, because he had spent 14 years raising a boy alone and had learned to recognize the difference between people who meant well and people who meant it. Monique meant it. He could see that the way you see load-bearing walls, not by looking at the surface, by understanding what the structure is holding up. They started that Saturday. The first 4 months, Monique did not let Isaiah play a single piece of music. Not one. She taught him hand position, how to curve the fingers so the knuckles formed an arch, how to keep the wrist level with the forearm, how to let the weight of the arm fall through the fingertip into the key rather than pressing down with muscle. This is the foundation of classical piano technique, and it matters more than most people realize. A pianist who learns wrong hand position can play for years, but will eventually hit a ceiling. The tendons fatigue faster, the speed caps out sooner. In serious cases, the damage becomes permanent. Monique had seen it. Monique had lived it. She was not going to let it happen to him. Isaiah was frustrated. He wanted to play music. He wanted to play the things he heard in his head. He sat at the Yamaha upright and practiced finger exercises and scales and arpeggios and wanted to scream. Monique watched his frustration the way a surgeon watches a patient resist physical therapy, with patience, without sympathy. Music is what happens after your hands know where to go without your brain telling them. That was her answer every time he asked when he would get to play something real. She was teaching him what neuroscientists call muscle memory, the process by which repeated physical practice creates neural pathways so efficient that the movement becomes automatic. Studies on young musicians have shown that learning an instrument during adolescence physically changes the structure of the brain. The corpus callosum thickens, the motor cortex develops more densely. The connection between hearing a sound and producing it becomes faster and more precise. Isaiah did not know any of this. He just knew his fingers hurt and the exercises were boring, and the woman upstairs would not let him play Chopin. The second year, she let him play. Bach inventions first, then Mozart sonatas, then carefully Chopin. And this was where the teaching changed. Because now Monique was not teaching his hands, she was teaching his ear. The difference between playing the right notes and playing the right meaning. In classical music, this is called phrasing. Two pianists can sit at the same piano and play the same piece note for note and produce completely different experiences. One plays the notes, the other plays the spaces between them. The weight of a single finger on a single key held for a fraction of a second longer. The way a phrase rises and falls, like a sentence spoken by someone who means what they are saying. Phrasing is where technique meets intention. It is where the instrument stops being a machine and starts being a voice. Monique taught Isaiah to listen before he played, to hear the shape of a phrase in his mind before his fingers touched the keys, to understand that silence is not the absence of music, it is part of it. Again, but this time, listen to what the silence between the notes is doing. She said that so many times it became a rhythm of its own. Isaiah heard it in his sleep. The third year, something shifted. Monique heard it before Isaiah knew it had happened. He was playing a passage from a Chopin nocturne, a phrase she had heard performed by hundreds of pianists over 40 years. And he changed something. Not a note, not the tempo, the weight. A single note in the middle of the phrase played with a fraction more pressure than the score indicated. Not louder, deeper. As if the note had something personal to say, and he was letting it speak. Monique stopped him. She did not correct him. She sat very still for a moment. Play that again. Exactly the way you just played it. He did. The same weight, the same depth. The same personal quality in a single note that turned a Chopin nocturne into something that was also an Isaiah Calloway nocturne. That is when a student stops being a student and becomes a musician. When the technique is so deeply learned that the person playing can forget about it entirely and start saying something that belongs only to them. Artistic interpretation. The moment where a performer stops reproducing and starts creating. Isaiah had found his voice on an old Yamaha upright with yellowed keys and a slow, sustained pedal in a third-floor apartment in West Philadelphia. He had never played a grand piano. He had never felt the difference in touch between an upright action and a grand action. The keys respond differently. The hammers strike from a different angle. The sound fills the room in a way an upright cannot replicate. He had learned everything he knew on Monique's old Yamaha. The instrument he would play at the talent show was a Steinway concert grand worth more than the building he lived in. He had never touched one. Monique's hands rested in her lap during every lesson now. The knuckles swollen, the fingers curved inward slightly at rest, a permanent reminder of what the joints couldn't. With her ears, with the particular precision of someone who could hear a wrong note the way a carpenter could feel a rough edge. She sat beside Isaiah on the bench and said things like, "Play it again, but this time let the left hand breathe," and he played it again and let the left hand breathe, and something in the room changed, and neither of them mentioned it because mentioning it would have reduced it. Her hands could no longer play. His hands played for her. Curtis's hands cleaned the piano every Friday. 3 pairs of hands and 1 instrument, connecting them all, though none of them had ever been in the same room with the same piano at the same time. Isaiah did not tell Curtis about the lessons. He practiced at Monique's apartment. He went upstairs after school on the days Curtis worked late, which was most days. He came back down before his father got home. He did his homework at the kitchen table and ate dinner and went to bed and said nothing. He was not ashamed. He was not hiding because he was embarrassed to play piano. He was hiding because he understood his father. He understood Curtis Calloway with the specific clarity of a child who has watched a single parent make calculations for 9 years. He knew the cost of the electricity in their apartment because the bill sat on the kitchen counter every month, and he had been reading it since he was tall enough to see over the edge. He knew his father skipped lunch most days. Not because Curtis ever said so, because the lunch bag Isaiah packed for him in the mornings came home in the same condition it left untouched. Curtis ate the school cafeteria leftovers, the kitchen staff set aside for custodial workers instead, free. So the food Isaiah packed could go back in the refrigerator and become tomorrow's dinner. If Curtis knew Isaiah played piano, Curtis would try to buy him one. That was simply the kind of father he was, the kind who would take a second job to buy something his son needed before his son finished saying he needed it. The kind who would work weekends and holidays and pick up extra shifts until the money appeared because the need had appeared, and Curtis Calloway did not look at his son's needs and walk past them. He would find a way, and the finding would cost him something he could not afford to give. More hours, more exhaustion, more years taken off a body that was already giving more than it had. Isaiah carried the piano key in his pocket. It was the only thing connected to music that his father had ever given him. And Curtis did not even know it was music he had given. He had handed his 7-year-old son a broken piece of ivory from a discarded piano and said, "I do not know what it is exactly, but it came from something that makes music." His father had given him music without knowing he was giving him music. That was the thing Isaiah could not stop thinking about, the accidental perfection of it. The unconscious generosity of a man whose hands cleaned pianos he did not play, and who had placed into his son's palm the single object that would connect them both to something neither of them fully understood yet. Signing up for the talent show meant the secret was over. If Isaiah played, Curtis would know, the school would know, everyone would know. The janitor's son played piano. And at Whitmore, where the distance between who you were and who they thought you were could be measured in parking lots and hallway names, and the particular way people looked through you when your father mopped their floors, being visible was not always safer than being invisible. Sometimes it was considerably more dangerous. Isaiah signed up anyway. He had his reasons. They were not small. 3 years at Whitmore had taught Isaiah how to read rooms the way certain animals learn to read terrain. Not for enjoyment, for navigation, for knowing where the safe ground was and where the ground dropped away. He ate lunch in the far corner of the cafeteria, the corner nearest the kitchen entrance where the staff came in and out with trays and supplies. He had not chosen the spot consciously, or maybe he had, the kind of choosing that happens below the level of decision, where the body finds the place it recognizes as closest to its own category, near the service entrance, near the workers, near the part of the building that functioned but was not meant to be seen. In group projects, his name was chosen last, not with cruelty. With the specific indifference of people who had never registered his presence strongly enough to have an opinion about it, he was not disliked. He was not avoided. He was simply not factored in. The way a hallway is not factored into a conversation about interior design. It connects the rooms, but nobody decorates it. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody says, "I wonder what the hallway thinks." When partners were selected in chemistry lab, there was always one empty stool between Isaiah and the nearest student. Always. Not because anyone moved away from him, because nobody moved toward him. The absence of cruelty is not the same thing as the presence of welcome. Isaiah knew this distinction the way he knew the bus schedule, precisely, from repetition. Brandon Hale was in 3 of Isaiah's classes. He sat in the middle of every room he entered, not by assignment, by gravity, the kind of student the space reorganized itself around. His father, Richard Hale, had donated the school's new science wing 2 years earlier. His name was on the plaque by the entrance. Brandon had been taking private piano lessons since he was 5 years old, $200 an hour. A Bosendorfer grand piano in the living room of his family's home in Bryn Mawr. He played at the school talent show every year. He was good. Not good in the way people say good when they mean acceptable. Good in the way people say good when they mean trained and polished and technically precise and capable of performing at a level that impressed audiences who understood what competence sounded like. His playing earned standing ovations from people who knew what good sounded like, but had never needed music to survive anything. Brandon was not a villain, he was not unkind, he was simply the finished product of a system that had been investing in him since birth. Confident, because confidence had been deposited into him by every institution he had ever passed through. Talented, because talent had been cultivated in him with resources most families could not access. Visible, because visibility was his inheritance. He did not need to earn the room's attention. The room had been built with his attention in mind. One afternoon, 3 months before the talent show, Isaiah was walking down the B hallway after last period. The hallway was mostly empty. Most students had already left for the day, and there, near the music room door, was Curtis, mop in hand, bucket beside him, methodically working the floor in long, even strokes the way he always did. With attention, with care, with the complete focus of a man doing his work well, because doing it well was the only version of the work he was willing to do. Isaiah saw him. Curtis looked up. They made eye contact. Curtis nodded. The daily nod. The small, familiar acknowledgement between a father and a son who shared a building but occupied different floors of its hierarchy. Isaiah nodded back. Then he turned to keep walking and saw 2 students behind him. They had seen the exchange. They were looking at Curtis, at the mop, at the bucket, then at Isaiah, then at each other. They did not say anything. They did not need to. The look contained everything the words would have. The quiet reclassification of Isaiah from student to something adjacent to the man with the mop, the mental note being filed, the confirmation of something they had always assumed but never bothered to verify. Isaiah kept walking. He did not look back. He did not say anything to Curtis. He went to his next obligation, and then home, and then to bed, and lay in the dark, and thought about that nod, his father's nod, the small, ordinary gesture of a man who had never once been embarrassed to be seen by his son while holding a mop, who had never lowered his eyes or turned away or waited until the hallway was empty, who nodded at his son in front of anyone because his son was his son and the mop was his work, and there was no contradiction between those 2 things in the mind of Curtis Calloway. If Isaiah ever stood on a stage, it would be for that nod, for the man who gave it, for the specific dignity of a father who cleaned a building full of people who did not see him and never once asked to be seen differently. 3 weeks before the talent show, Isaiah sat in Monique's living room after a lesson. The Yamaha upright was still open. The room still held the shape of the Chopin they had been working on. He had played the ballad from beginning to end without stopping for the first time that afternoon. Not perfectly, but completely, which is a different thing. He looked at Monique. She was sitting in the chair beside the piano with her hands in her lap, the hands that had once played Carnegie Hall, the hands that now rested with their swollen knuckles and their permanent curve like parentheses, holding something that had already been said. "Do you think I could play the ballad at the school show?" Monique did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a long time, the kind of looking that is also listening. Then she asked the question back in a different shape. "Are you asking me if you are ready, or are you asking me if you should?" Isaiah said nothing, because the answer was both. And because both answers frightened him for different reasons. Monique leaned back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at the piano, then at him. "I performed at Carnegie Hall in front of 2,800 people, 1988. I played Chopin, the same Chopin you just played. The reviews the next day were the best reviews I ever received. That was not the hardest performance of my life. The hardest performance of my life was a recital I gave in a church basement in North Philadelphia for 40 people who had never heard live classical music before. Folding chairs, no stage, a borrowed upright that had not been tuned in months. That audience did not owe me their attention. They had not paid for tickets. They had not read my name in a program. I had to earn every second of it, with nothing between me and them except the music. That is the performance that matters, the one where you have nothing to hide behind." She paused. "You are ready. The question of whether you should is not mine to answer. That one belongs to you." Isaiah went to the school office the next morning and signed up. He wrote his name on the form. Isaiah Calloway. Instrument, piano. Piece, Chopin Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The ballade is one of the most demanding works in the classical piano repertoire. It runs approximately 10 minutes. It opens with a single octave in the bass register, quiet, almost tentative. Then a melody enters. Simple, unhurried. The kind of beginning that does not announce what is coming. Over the next 10 minutes, the piece builds through layers of increasing complexity and emotional intensity until it arrives at a coda that is among the most technically explosive passages Chopin ever wrote. It starts like a question someone is afraid to ask. It ends like an answer the question did not know it was looking for. Monique had chosen it for Isaiah because the piece was Isaiah, the quiet beginning, the long patient middle where the skill is being assembled without anyone watching, and the ending that could not be predicted from the start. His name appeared on the bulletin board outside the auditorium the following Monday. 12 acts listed in performance order. Isaiah Calloway, piano, number 11. There was no other information beside his name, no mention of Curtis Calloway, head custodian. But at Whitmore, the name Calloway was already assigned. It belonged to the man with the mop and the supply cart and the staff parking lot behind the building. Everyone who read that bulletin board knew exactly whose son had signed up to play piano on the same stage. Their parents had donated, and their teachers had reserved, and their classmates had performed on every year without anyone from the custodial staff's family ever appearing on the list. Isaiah walked past the bulletin board and did not look at it again. The week that followed had a texture Isaiah could feel, but no one spoke aloud. It was not bullying. It was not confrontation. It was something quieter and in its own way more precise. A laugh in the hallway that stopped when he turned the corner, but had clearly been about him because two girls were looking at the bulletin board, and one of them was covering her mouth. A question asked in the cafeteria at a volume designed to carry weight. Calloway. Like custodian Calloway. The question was not cruel. It was just clarifying. The way someone clarifies whether a name on a restaurant reservation belongs to the guest or the valet. A categorization. An assignment of place. Brandon Hale heard about it. He did not comment. He did not laugh. He did not say anything at all, which was its own kind of statement. The particular dismissal of someone who does not need to deny the existence of a challenger because the challenger has not yet risen to the level where denial is required. Brandon was performing at the show as well. Liszt, Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. He had been preparing for months with his private instructor. He would play 7th. Isaiah would play 11th. Brandon did not acknowledge the proximity. He simply continued being Brandon Hale in the way that weather continues being weather. Present, undisturbed, not organized around anyone else's arrival. Curtis heard about it in the staff break room. A Tuesday. He was refilling his water bottle at the sink when one of the kitchen workers, a woman named Gloria, who had been at Whitmore almost as long as Curtis had said it, without looking up from her sandwich. "Your boy signed up for the talent show." Piano. Curtis stopped. His hand was on the faucet. The water was still running. He turned it off. He set down the water bottle. He looked at the wall above the sink. A schedule was pinned there. Cleaning rotations for the week. He looked at it without reading it. Then he picked up the water bottle. He screwed the cap back on. He went back to work. He did not go home that evening and ask his son about it. He went home and set the table for dinner and waited. The night before the talent show, Isaiah lay on his bed in the dark. He was not practicing. Monique had told him not to practice the night before a performance. Your hands already know. Let your mind rest. So he lay on his back with his jacket folded beside him and his right hand in the pocket and his fingers wrapped around the ivory key, the way they always were when he was thinking about something he could not say out loud. He thought about his mother. He tried to hear her voice. He could not. That was the thing about losing someone when you are 7. The voice goes first, before the face, before the way they moved through a room. The sound of them is the first thing that fades because sound is the most fragile kind of memory. It does not hold its shape the way a photograph does. It thins and stretches, and eventually it is gone, and all that is left is the knowledge that there was a voice, and it belonged to someone you loved, and you can no longer reproduce it inside your own head. He remembered that she sang. In the kitchen. In the mornings. Not songs with names. Not performances. Just the sound of a woman singing while she made breakfast, because singing was what she did in the mornings, the way Curtis wrote notes on the counter. A habit. A way of being. Isaiah could not remember the melodies, but he remembered the fact of them. His mother sang. His father wrote notes. His mother's music came from her voice. His father's music came from a piano key he picked up off a hallway floor without knowing what he was picking up. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for a long time. In the kitchen, one floor below where Isaiah lay, Curtis sat at the table. The apartment was quiet. Isaiah's door was closed. Curtis had the notepad in front of him, the pen in his hand. He was writing the morning note earlier than usual, not because he had somewhere to be, because he could not sleep either. He wrote the 4 words, "Do good work today." The same 4 words, the same handwriting, the same torn square of paper from the pad beside the phone. But tonight he sat with the pen in his hand for a long time after writing them. He knew what tomorrow was. He knew his son was going to walk onto a stage that Curtis had polished on his knees the previous Friday. He knew that 400 people were going to be sitting in an auditorium watching his son do something Curtis had not known his son could do until a kitchen worker mentioned it in a break room 4 days ago. He knew some of them would laugh. He had heard enough conversations in hallways over 14 years to understand exactly what happened when someone from the wrong part of the building stepped into the wrong kind of light. He did not know how to prevent it. He knew he should not try. Because Isaiah had chosen this. And Curtis was the kind of father who believed his son needed to be allowed to make his own choices, even the ones that might hurt. Especially those. Because protecting someone from every hard thing is not the same as preparing them for a world that contains hard things. And Curtis had spent 16 years preparing Isaiah for the world as it was, not the world as Curtis wished it would be. He set the note on the counter beside the plate he would fill with eggs at 4:30 in the morning. He turned off the kitchen light. He did not go to bed yet. He sat in the dark for a while. In the chair that was his. Across from the chair that was still Denise's. On the 3rd floor, Monique Delphine Watts sat at the Yamaha upright in her living room. The apartment was dark, except for the small lamp beside the piano. She placed her hands on the keys. She did not play. She just rested them there. The fingers curving inward, the knuckles swollen and stiff. The hands that had once been described as being able to hold a conversation with the keys, now sitting on those keys in silence. Having nothing left to say in a language they could no longer speak fluently. She thought about the last time she had performed in public, 22 years ago, a recital at a small hall in Boston. She had known during the performance that something was wrong. The 3rd finger on her left hand had not responded the way it should have in a passage she had played 1,000 times. A fraction of a second late, a fraction of control missing. Nobody in the audience heard it. She heard it, and she knew. She thought about all the pieces she would never play again. The Chopin ballades, the Debussy preludes, the Rachmaninoff concerto she had been preparing when the diagnosis came and never finished learning. 22 years of silence, sitting on a piano bench. Then she thought about Isaiah. Tomorrow he was going to play the ballad she could no longer play. On a Steinway concert, grand his father cleaned every Friday. In an auditorium full of people who did not expect him to be there, he was going to place his hands on the keys the way she had taught him. Curved fingers, level wrist, weight falling through the fingertip. Everything she had given him over 3 years of Saturday afternoons and Tuesday evenings and the occasional Thursday when Curtis worked late. Every teacher who has ever loved a student understands this. The moment when what you gave away comes back in a form you did not expect. Wearing a face you did not choose. Playing notes, you can no longer reach yourself. It is not pride, exactly. It is something older than pride. Something closer to the feeling of having planted a seed in someone else's ground and watching it grow into something that belongs to them completely and has nothing to do with you anymore, except that you were the one who put it there. She lifted her hands from the keys. She closed the lid. She turned off the lamp. 3 people in 3 rooms in the same city. 1 piece of music between them. None of them slept well. The evening of the talent show, the auditorium at Whitmore Preparatory Academy was full by 6:45, 400 seats, nearly all of them taken. The oak stage floor had been polished earlier that week. The Steinway Model D sat at center stage with its lid propped open and the black lacquer catching the overhead lights in a way that made it look like it was made of something deeper than wood and metal, like it was made of the dark itself shaped into an instrument. The audience was parents and students and faculty. The parents dressed the way Whitmore parents dressed for evening events. Not formal, not casual. The specific in-between that costs more than either. Printed programs on heavy cardstock. 12 acts. Violin, vocal ensemble, contemporary dance, cello, spoken word, piano, piano again, guitar, a cappella trio, flute, piano one more time, and then another piano. The program listed each performer's name and piece. Act 7. Brandon Hale. List. Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. Act 11. Isaiah Calloway. Chopin. Ballade No. 1, in G minor. Richard Hale sat in the second row with his wife. She held a camera in her lap. He was turned sideways in his seat, talking to the headmaster about something that involved both of them leaning in and nodding. The body language of men who are comfortable deciding things in rooms built for their comfort. Curtis came in last. After the lights had already dimmed, he had changed out of his work clothes. White dress shirt, the only one he owned. Dark slacks. Shoes that were old but polished with the attention he gave to everything he maintained. He sat in the last row, the farthest seat from the stage, alone. The way he had always existed in this building. Close enough to see everything. Far enough away that nobody saw him. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the stage. At the piano he had wiped down 2 days ago. At the floor he had polished on his knees. At the lights that were pointed at a place his son was about to stand. He had cleaned every surface of that stage. He had never once stood on it. Monique was not in the auditorium. She had told Isaiah that morning, "I will not be in the room. You do not need me in the room. You need to play for yourself." She was at home, sitting in her living room in the dark. The Yamaha upright closed, her hands in her lap, waiting the way you wait when someone you have taught everything you know is about to find out whether the teaching was enough. The first act was a girl named Catherine who played violin. She had been Suzuki trained since she was 4 years old. Her parents had driven her to lessons in Center City 3 times a week for 12 years. She played a Mendelssohn concerto movement with the precision of someone who had been shaped by the instrument since before she could read. Clean intonation, confident bowing. The audience clapped warmly. Her mother, in the 5th row, recorded the entire thing on her phone. The third act was an a cappella group of 6 students who had been working with a private vocal coach since September. They sang a 4-part arrangement of a song the audience recognized. Tight harmonies, choreographed movement. The kind of polished performance that comes from rehearsal space and resources and the specific confidence of young people who have been told since childhood that their voices are worth hearing. The 5th act was a girl who danced contemporary, trained, fluid. The kind of movement that communicates years of studio time in every line of the body. All of them were good. All of them belonged to the category of talent that Whitmore expected to see on its stage. Cultivated. Invested in. The natural output of a system that had been pouring resources into these children for as long as they had been alive. The audience clapped after each one with the satisfied recognition of people watching returns on an investment they understood. Then Act 7, Brandon Hale. He walked to the Steinway with the ease of someone who had been walking to pianos his entire life. He sat down. He adjusted the bench. He placed his hands. No hesitation. No visible nerves. The body language of a performer who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. He played Liszt, Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, one of the most recognizable pieces in the classical piano repertoire. Fast, dramatic, full of passages that require the kind of finger speed and wrist flexibility that only comes from years of daily practice under professional supervision. Brandon played it without a single audible error. His tempo was precise. His dynamics were controlled. The fast octave passages in the middle section landed exactly where they were supposed to land. The dramatic pauses were timed with the instinct of someone who understood that silence was part of the performance. He finished. The room stood. His mother stood first. His father clapped with both hands raised slightly. The headmaster nodded from the side of the auditorium. Brandon stood and took a bow that was neither too long nor too short. The bow of someone who had been taught how to receive applause the same way he had been taught how to earn it. He was good. Not good as a compliment. Good as a fact. The kind of good that is built with $200 lessons and a Bosendorfer in the living room and a decade of instruction that never missed a week. Curtis watched from the last row. He did not know the piece. He did not know Liszt from Chopin from anything else. But he knew what it looked like when someone did something well. He had spent 14 years watching people do things well, and doing things well himself. And the boy at that piano was good at what he did. Curtis felt something settle in his stomach. Not doubt exactly. Something closer. Fear. For the first time since he had heard about the talent show in the break room, he was afraid for his son. 4 more acts, then Isaiah. The student hosting the show stepped to the microphone. He read from the program. Act 11. Isaiah Calloway. Piano. Chopin. Ballade number 1 in G minor. 1 second of silence. Then the sound began. Not laughter. Not yet. First, the whisper. The specific ripple that moves through a room when a name lands in a context it was not expected to occupy. Calloway. The name that belonged to the supply closet and the mop cart and the staff lot behind the building. That Calloway on the program. At the piano, the whisper became something else. Not loud, not pointed. Just the soft, stifled sound of people reacting to something they found mildly and unexpectedly amusing. A few students in the middle rows covering their mouths. A girl turning to the girl beside her with eyes that said what her mouth did not need to. A parent in the 6th row leaning to her husband and murmuring something that included the word custodian. Not cruelty. Not bullying. Something worse in its own way. The quiet consensus of a room that had already decided the outcome before the performance began. Isaiah walked out from the wings. Clean pants, dark shirt, the shoes Curtis had polished that morning. He was tall, thin, moving without hurry. He did not look at the audience. He looked at the piano. The Steinway sat under the lights the way it always sat on that stage. Black, open, waiting. He had seen it every day for 3 years through the auditorium doors. He had never touched it. His father had touched it 1,000 times. Every Friday. With a flannel cloth and a bottle of polish and the quiet attention of a man who maintained things that did not belong to him as if they did. The laughter grew slightly as he crossed the stage. Not from everyone, from enough. A few younger students who had not learned to hide their reactions. A few parents whose amusement sat just below the surface of their composed faces. The specific laugh adults use when they believe they already know how something will end. Brandon Hale sat in the 3rd row. He did not laugh. His face held an expression that was not contempt and not interest. It was the expression of someone who had already moved on to the next thing. The particular dismissal of a person who does not consider the current moment worth the effort of a reaction. Curtis heard the laughter from the last row. His hands tightened on his knees. He did not stand. He did not speak. He did not turn to look at the people around him. He sat perfectly still in the way of a man who had spent 14 years being still while people walked past him and who understood that the only thing worse than his son being laughed at would be his son being pitied. Isaiah reached the piano. His right hand went to his jacket pocket. His fingers found the ivory key. He wrapped his hand around it once, the way he always did. Then he took off the jacket and draped it over the back of the bench. He sat down. He looked at the keys, 88 of them, black and white. The same instrument his father wiped clean every Friday with hands that had never played a note. Isaiah placed his hands on the keys. The laughter had not stopped. He placed his hands on the keys. The Chopin Ballade number 1 in G minor begins with a single unison octave, two C notes played together, low register. The sound is not dramatic, it is not fast, it is almost tentative, like a question being asked by someone who is not certain they are allowed to ask it. Then a melody enters above, simple, slow, rising and falling in a line that could be mistaken for something easy if you did not understand what is coming. Isaiah played the opening octave. The sound that came from the Steinway was nothing like the sound of Monique's upright. It was deeper, wider. It filled the auditorium the way water fills a space, reaching into corners and settling into the air with a resonance the Yamaha could not produce. The instrument was different from every instrument he had ever touched. The keys were heavier, the action faster, the sustain longer and richer and more alive. He felt the difference in his fingertips immediately. 3 years of practice on an old upright in a third-floor apartment, and now this, a concert grand worth more than the building he lived in. He adjusted, the way his father adjusted every time a new building was assigned to his care. You learn the space. You work with what it gives you. You do not complain about the difference between where you practiced and where you are performing. You just listen, and you respond. The melody entered, simple, unhurried, the kind of musical line that sounds like someone thinking out loud, not performing, thinking, and the laughter began to thin. The front row went quiet first, because they were closest, because sound is a physical thing that enters your body through your ears and rearranges what you were thinking without asking permission. The people in the front row heard it first and stopped doing whatever they had been doing and simply listened. Then the second row, then the third, the silence spreading backward through the auditorium like a tide reversing, the laughter pulling away from the stage row by row, replaced by something that did not have a name yet, just attention, just the involuntary response of human beings to a sound that is doing something unexpected. Mr. Fielding, the school's music teacher, sat in an aisle seat near the middle of the auditorium. He had been teaching music at Whitmore for 15 years. He had heard Brandon Hale play dozens of times. He knew what technical proficiency sounded like. He could identify proper hand position and correct pedaling and accurate tempo by ear, the way a mechanic identifies engine problems by sound. What he was hearing now was something different. This was not technique performing emotion. This was emotion that had learned technique well enough to speak. Brandon Hale's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. His eyes opened slightly wider, his back straightened by a fraction. The involuntary physical response of a pianist hearing another pianist do something they had not anticipated. He did not move. He did not look away. He sat in his seat and listened with the specific attention of someone whose understanding of the instrument was being quietly rearranged. Curtis sat in the last row and did not understand the music. He did not know Chopin. He did not know what a ballade was. He did not know the key of G minor, or what an octave passage meant, or why the left hand was doing what it was doing beneath the right. But he heard his son, the way you hear someone you have known their entire life. Not the notes, the person inside the notes, the rhythm that was the same rhythm Isaiah tapped on the kitchen table, the phrasing that rose and fell the way Isaiah's voice rose and fell when he was telling a story he cared about, something in the playing that was inherited, not taught, passed down through years of living in the same apartment, and eating at the same table, and breathing the same air. He did not know the music. He knew his son. And his son was in every note. The ballad was building. Isaiah's hands were steady. The room was no longer laughing. The room was no longer doing anything except listening. The ballade builds. That is what it does. It begins with that quiet question, and then it answers itself in stages, each one larger than the last, each one adding weight and speed and complexity, until the music is no longer asking anything, it is declaring. The development section of the Chopin Ballade No. 1 contains passages that are among the most demanding in the romantic piano repertoire. Octave runs that require both hands to move in parallel at speeds that test the limits of what the human hand can do. Chromatic passages that cascade down the keyboard like controlled falling. Chords struck fortissimo that used the full weight of the arms and shoulders to produce a sound that is not played so much as released. Isaiah played all of it. He played it the way Monique had taught him. Not as an exercise, as a story, each passage connected to the one before it. Each crescendo, arriving not because the score said so, but because the music demanded it the way a sentence demands its conclusion. He was not thinking about his hands. His hands knew. 3 years of muscle memory. 3 years of Monique sitting beside him saying again, but this time listen to what the silence between the notes is doing. His hands knew where to go. His mind was somewhere else entirely. Then the Chopin ended. The final fortissimo chords struck, and the sound hung in the auditorium for a moment. Vibrating, settling. And Isaiah did not stop. He did not lift his hands. He did not pause. He moved, seamlessly, without a break, into something else, a different melody, slower, simpler, almost crude compared to the Chopin. A melody that did not come from a textbook or a score or a composer who had been dead for 170 years. A melody that came from a 13-year-old boy tapping his fingers on a kitchen table in a second-floor apartment in West Philadelphia while his father cooked dinner 20 feet away. A melody that had started as rhythm, just rhythm, fingers on wood, the pattern that Monique had heard through a thin wall and recognized as the shape of someone who could hear music inside ordinary sound. She had helped him turn the rhythm into notes. She had helped him build it into a piece. But the thing inside it was his, the sound of his mother singing in the kitchen on mornings he could no longer fully remember. The sound of a mop moving across linoleum in long, steady strokes. The sound of a pen writing 4 words on a piece of paper every morning before dawn. Do good work today. Curtis heard it. He did not know he was hearing it. Then he did. The rhythm. The specific pattern his son had been tapping on the kitchen table for years. The pattern Curtis had assumed was a nervous habit, a fidget, an unconscious thing the boy did while he was thinking about something else. It was not unconscious. It had never been unconscious. It was music. It had been music the whole time. And in that moment, Curtis understood that his son had been telling him everything for years, in a language he had not known was a language. Mr. Fielding took off his glasses. He cleaned them with the edge of his shirt. He put them back on. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. A woman in the 4th row placed her hand on her chest. She was not aware she was doing it. Brandon Hale looked down at his own hands, the hands that had played the Hungarian Rhapsody flawlessly 2 hours earlier, the hands that had earned a standing ovation and a nod from the headmaster and the satisfied approval of an audience that knew what good sounded like. He looked at his hands and for the first time in his life asked himself whether perfect was the same thing as enough, whether technique without necessity was the same as technique that had been forged inside necessity. He did not have an answer. He would not have one for a long time, but the question had entered him, and questions like that, once they enter, do not leave. Something fell from Curtis's face onto the back of his hand. He did not wipe it. He did not move. He sat in the last row of an auditorium he had mopped 1,000 times and listened to his son play the piano he had wiped clean every Friday for 14 years. The piano he had never played. The piano he had given to his son without knowing he was giving it. The way he had given him a broken ivory key on a Sunday afternoon 9 years ago. Without understanding, without intention, just the instinct of a man who picked things up and handed them to the people he loved. The melody ended. Isaiah's hands lifted from the keys. His fingers trembled, not from fear. From the specific emptiness of having poured everything through an instrument for 12 minutes and having nothing left, the auditorium was silent. The janitor's hands had cleaned the instrument. The teacher's hands had shaped the gift. The boy's hands had done the rest. 3 pairs of hands, 1 piece of music. The room understood this without anyone explaining it. 2 seconds of silence. 3. The auditorium held its breath the way a room holds its breath when something has happened that it does not yet know how to categorize. Isaiah sat at the piano with his hands suspended above the keys. His fingers were trembling, not from fear, from the specific emptiness of having given everything you had to give through a single instrument for 12 minutes and having nothing left inside your hands to give. He thought he had failed. The silence was too long, too complete, the kind of silence that could mean anything. He stared at the keys. 88 of them, black and white. Still. Then, a sound from the last row, a single pair of hands, heavy, rough, producing a clap that did not sound like the other claps that had filled this room all evening. It was thicker, harder. The sound of calloused palms striking each other with the full weight of 14 years of work behind them. Curtis Calloway stood up, alone, in the last row, in his white dress shirt, clapping the way a man claps when he is not performing approval, but expressing something that has no other exit from his body. Then Mr. Fielding, standing, clapping. Then the seats around him. Then the row in front of that. The sound spread the way rain begins on a tin roof. A few drops, then more. Then a sound that is no longer individual drops, but a single continuous thing that fills the air and makes it impossible to hear, where one pair of hands ends and another begins. 400 people on their feet. The applause moving forward, through the auditorium, from back to front. The opposite direction of the laughter that had moved the same way 20 minutes earlier. Isaiah looked up. He found the last row. The white shirt, the man standing in it, his father, hands still moving, face still, eyes holding something that had been building for 14 years in hallways and break rooms, and Friday afternoons spent polishing an instrument that had just spoken in a voice Curtis recognized as his own son's. Isaiah looked at his father. Curtis looked at his son. Neither of them nodded. Neither of them waved. Neither of them moved in any way that would translate the moment into a gesture. They just looked at each other across 400 seats and the full distance of 3 years of silence and the entire length of a secret that had just ended, the way two people look at each other when words would reduce what is happening between them. Brandon Hale was the last person in the auditorium to stand. He rose slowly. He clapped. Not fast, not with the automatic enthusiasm of someone joining a crowd. Slowly, deliberately, the clap of a musician processing what another musician had just done to the instrument they shared. He would never say it aloud, not to his parents, not to his teacher, not to anyone, but he knew. Something had happened on that stage that his $200 lessons and his Bosendorfer and his 12 years of training had not prepared him to hear, not because it was better, because it was different in a way that made the word better irrelevant. On the 3rd floor of a building in West Philadelphia, Monique Delphine Watts sat in her living room in the dark. The Yamaha upright was closed. Her hands were in her lap. She was not in the auditorium. She had not heard a note. But she knew, the way a teacher always knows. The way you know when something you built has finally been tested and has held. She reached forward. She lifted the lid of the piano. She placed one finger on a key, G, the note the ballad begins with. She pressed it. The knuckle ached. The joint resisted. The note came out, slightly uneven. But it came out. It filled the room. One note. After 4 years of silence, it hurt. But it sounded right. It was the first note she had played in 4 years. That night, Isaiah and Curtis sat at the kitchen table. The same table. The note that said, "Do good work today," was still on the counter from that morning. The plate from breakfast was in the drying rack. The chair across from Curtis was empty the way it had been empty for 9 years. Isaiah told him everything. Monique, the lessons, 3 years, the upright Yamaha with the slow sustained pedal, the technique and the phrasing, and the nights he came back downstairs before Curtis got home and pretended he had been doing homework. He told him about the piece he had written himself, about the rhythm, about the tapping on the kitchen table that had never been a nervous habit. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the ivory key and set it on the table between them. He told his father why he had kept the secret. "I did not tell you because I did not want you to try to buy me a piano we cannot afford." Curtis looked at the ivory key on the table. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. "You were right. I would have tried. A beat." and I would have figured it out. Not a reprimand, not anger, not hurt, just the quiet correction of a man telling his son that the weight his son had been carrying alone was supposed to be shared. That protecting your father from his own instincts is a kind thing to do. But it is not your job. Your job is to play the piano. My job is to figure out the rest. That is how this works. Isaiah looked at him. Curtis picked up the ivory key and turned it over in his hand and set it back down. That was all. They sat at the table for a while longer. Then Curtis got up and made coffee. He poured 2 cups. He had never poured Isaiah a cup of coffee before. He set it in front of his son and sat back down, and they drank coffee at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night and did not say much more because the talking had already happened. On a stage, through a piano. In a language they were both only now beginning to understand, they shared. The next morning the headmaster found Curtis in the hallway near the science wing. She had worked at Whitmore for 8 years. In that time she had spoken to Curtis about plumbing, about heating, about a leak in the gymnasium ceiling. She had never spoken to him about his son. She stood in front of him now in her blazer and her identification badge and said, "I did not know your son played." Curtis looked at her. He held the mop handle. His hands were still. "Neither did I, until last night." She heard both meanings. The first was literal. The second was the one that would stay with her for a long time afterward. Neither did I. An entire school had walked past this boy for 3 years, the same way they walked past his father. Not with cruelty, with the particular blindness of people who had already decided what the custodian's son was before he ever had a chance to show them what he could be. Isaiah went to Monique's apartment that afternoon. He sat in the chair beside the Yamaha. He told her about the performance, about the silence, about the applause, about his father in the last row, about the kitchen table. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened, with her whole body. Then Isaiah noticed the piano lid was open. It had been closed for as long as he had known her. "I played a note last night. Just one." He looked at her. She looked at her hands, the swollen knuckles, the curved fingers. It hurt, but it sounded right. One note. 1 G. After 4 years of deciding that playing below her standard was worse than not playing at all, she had played a single note in the dark, while her student performed on a stage she would never stand on again. Isaiah had not given her back her hands. The arthritis had not reversed itself. What he had given her back was the reason to use them. Not to perform, not to prove, just to press a key and hear it ring in a quiet room and remember that the sound still belonged to her. Mr. Fielding submitted a recommendation the following week for Isaiah to be considered for a music scholarship at a conservatory in New York. He attached a recording from the talent show camera. He wrote in the margin of the recommendation letter that it was the finest student performance he had heard in 15 years of teaching. Richard Hale called Brandon's piano instructor the following Monday and asked why his son's performance had not sounded like that. The instructor, who had watched the video twice, said something Richard did not expect and did not enjoy hearing. "Your son plays beautifully. That boy plays necessarily. They are not the same thing." A few students at Whitmore began sitting near Isaiah in the cafeteria. Not many, a few, not out of pity, out of curiosity. The boy who had been invisible for 3 years had revealed an entire interior world they had never thought to ask about. It did not undo 3 years of being looked through, but it opened something. A question. What else had they not noticed? What else had been sitting right beside them, playing itself out in silence? 400 people sat in that auditorium a few feet from a piano for years. They attended concerts and talent shows and assemblies and ceremonies. They sat in those seats while a man nobody noticed polished the instrument every Friday with hands nobody watched. Only one of them, the man with the mop, had a son who knew how to make it speak. He did not know he had given his son that gift. He had just picked up a broken key off a hallway floor and handed it to a 7-year-old boy who needed something to hold. Some people will say this story is about talent winning over circumstance. That a gifted boy rose above his situation through hard work and a kind teacher and the courage to sit down at an instrument in front of people who had already decided he did not belong there. Others will say this story is about a system that almost buried that talent entirely, that noticed it only by accident. In a talent show, because the boy was brave enough to sit down uninvited at a piano that was never meant for him. Both of those readings are correct. Neither is the one that will stay with you longest. The question that stays is this: how many Isaiah Callaways are sitting in rooms right now, carrying something extraordinary in their pockets, waiting for someone to stop laughing long enough to listen? This story is fiction. Isaiah and Curtis and Monique are not real people, but the world they live in is. According to the National Guild for Community Arts Education, fewer than 20% of public schools in low-income areas in the United States have a full music program. Children in underfunded neighborhoods are 5 times less likely to have access to music education than children in wealthy ones. Talent is not distributed by zip code, but opportunity is. I wrote this story because I believe the most dangerous thing a society can do is decide who deserves to be heard before giving them a chance to speak or play. You have been in rooms where someone was laughed at. You may be the person who was laughed at. The piano is still there. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel. New stories every week. See you in the next one.